Welcome to the North Coast School of Education's self-paced presentation, Best Practices in Online Teaching. As part of the Sonoma County Office of Education, the North Coast School of Education provides a mentor-based framework for educator preparation, professional learning, and credentialing services to new and inspiring interns, teachers, and administrators. This presentation also includes a handout that synthesizes the information that you will learn here, as well as an action plan template. You may want to print these out or have them open in another window so that throughout the presentation, you can pause the recording and capture your own ideas and practices as you plan. My name is Susan Takami. I'm a program coordinator at the North Coast School of Education. I'll be your facilitator today, along with presenter Mark Neiman, curriculum coordinator. I have 20 plus years in education and training, and my credentials are both in social studies and world languages, where I also held a position as department chair. I have experience in high school administration, and my research interests are place-based education, language justice, and community cultural wealth. Our presenter today, Mark Neiman, has over 20 years in education and has taught from kindergarten through master's programs. His credentials and masters are in science and education technology, and he is the very proud parent of a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. So why are we here? The purpose of this session is to build our confidence as we are expanding our online teaching and learning experiences, and really focuses on just that fundamental reality that good teaching is universal, whether you are in a online, blended, or in-person environment. And so today we'll be sharing some basic tools to help you support a successful online instruction experience. So in today's session, we'll be focusing on the 5 best practices of cultivating relationships, building community, communicating effectively, engaging students, and providing feedback. So as you're looking at these, what might they have in common? You may notice that these are good teaching practices that are relevant to any learning environment. So as we move forward throughout this presentation, you'll find that these best practices are expanded and explained in greater detail on the handout, and again on the action plan where you can capture your own notes and ideas. And so as we explore these, much of what we'll be doing today will feel like common sense for many of you, and you may already do this in your classroom. We are by no means the experts in this, and we're simply learners along the way on this journey with you. So let's begin by cultivating relationships with our presenter, Mark Neiman.
Thank you, Susan. To cultivate relationships, we're going to start with a few quotes that I think are powerful about relationships. Students learn from people they love, from David Brooks of the New York Times. No significant learning happens without a significant relationship, from James Cormer. And many of you may know Rita Pearson from her TED Talk. Kids don't learn from people they don't like. These seem like appropriate things to consider as we start looking towards what it means to cultivate relationships with our students in ways that we are maybe not used to. One of the foundations of cultivating relationships is getting to know one another. One of the ways we can do that is by creating an assignment or an activity with our students that helps us get to know one another. This is an example of a slide deck you could create where students could contribute to it. I've built one for myself here that has quotes and images of important parts of my life that I like to share with people. So an example I have is my name at the top, then underneath, I am a parent, an educator, and a passionate environmental steward. For each one of those things, I've included a quote as well as an image. So the first quote is here. It says, "Who we are and how we engage with the world are much stronger predictors of how our children will do than what we know about parenting." Second quote, oh, that was by Brene Brown. The second quote we have here is, "When you leave this earth, you can take nothing that you have received, only what you have given." That's from St. Francis of Assisi. And the last quote I have here is from John Muir. "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds that it is attached to the rest of the world." This is a way to present something that's got images as well as words that shows a little bit of who the person is. And it can be a great activity for you to do with your students or even your parents as you build your relationships throughout your class. So when it comes to cultivating relationships, we need to think about what we currently do to build relationships in our classrooms. What are things you currently do, or I should say, did previously to being in an online teaching environment to build relationships with your students? And what would it take to translate some of those things that you do or you've done in your classroom to an online environment? How do we build those relationships and how do we cultivate them in an online environment? I'm going to go through a list of a few simple things we can do to help cultivate those relationships. The first one I have is to find a way to share something personal. This gives your students a view into your life that allows you to be viewed as a person as well as their teacher. We all know how how students react when they see us in the grocery store or someplace and they catch us out of context, but it adds a human element to that relationship. It allows you to be a person as well as their teacher. This does not mean you need to share or disclose something that's inappropriate or overshare with them. It just means find something personal that helps them connect to you. The second thing is modeling vulnerability. This builds trust with your students. Letting your students know that this experience of teaching online is new to you and there are things that you struggle with as well is a way to validate their struggles. Showing healthy ways to deal with fear, frustration, sadness, and all the other emotions that come along with the sudden changes that we've been going through lets your students know that these feelings are okay and that they have permission to feel them. The next thing is getting to know your students as well as your parents. Create an assignment that students can where they can create something to show you who they are and what they're passionate about. An example is what I just showed you about me on that slide. There could be videos, there could be all kinds of different things where they can show you more about them personally. Help them get to know you as well by participating in that assignment. Another very important thing is using their names and using their names properly, knowing how to pronounce their names, using them in emails, however you communicate with them. It's a way to validate who they are and know that they are seen by you. And lastly is communicate directly. Personal connections take time but are almost always worth it. Send an email to check in, letting them know when and where you are available. And create a hard copy of your list of students with images and all the important information about them so you can be specific in those communications. So there's something personal in those communications with them. But communicating with students and parents directly is a really important way to validate who they are and make sure they know that they're important. The next section we're looking at is building community. This is a unique opportunity that we have as educators to build relationships between parents, students, and us. This is a fascinating time that parents are much more engaged in their students' education in many situations than they have ever been. This allows us as teachers to help foster that and facilitate that. This is going to include building relationships between students and their parents, as well as students and other students online. This can be a very complex situation, but it's a foundation for what can be a successful online experience. Here are a few key points to help build community in your online classroom. Make a connection with parents. Consider having a parent meeting to answer any questions and clarify expectations for the semester. Communication plays a huge role in building community. Having this initial communication with parents will be a foundation for your success. Engage in the student introductions. Like I said in the last slide of building relationships, when you engage in those introductions with them, that helps to build the community. Possibly create introductions with the parents. Get to know them a little bit better. Find out some more information about them and allow them to create a slide about themselves. Building community can also be fostered by collaborating on the goals and norms. When students and parents have an opportunity to work together on setting goals and norms for the class, that makes them feel part of what's going on, part of that community. Build activities that facilitate student to student collaboration. You can create assignments and events and activities that encourage students to work together. We do this in our class. We also need to be doing this online. How do we think about creating assignments to help students work together, not just individually? And the last one I have here is creating opportunities for students and parents to connect. We want to make sure that we're not overloading parents, because we know parents are already feeling quite stressed in these times. But consider the role that we play in fostering a healthy collaborative relationship between parents and their children. How can we help create assignments that can involve parent interaction with their students? We can have different entry points for the parents that parents are going to have different comfort levels with. Things like art projects or cooking projects. They can do interviews. They can have a technology collaboration for parents who are more technologically savvy. Or it could be something like an outdoor adventure or an exploratory activity. Those are all ways that students can have activities where they're engaging with their parents in a different way. I'm going to turn this back over to Susan for communicating effectively.
A tool to cultivating relationships and building community is through communication. And so as you develop your communication plan to work with your students, families, and caregivers, here's some guidelines to follow that will make your communication more effective. Capture their attention. Get them to open the email. Get them engaging with what you're sending them. Effective communication also gives a starting point. It helps students to understand just even how to begin. Let's see, keep it clear and concise, keep it brief. People are overloaded with information, especially through their email. Make it short. Set expectations, let them know, what you're expecting when you're expecting, to create some of those boundaries. And above all, keep it positive and encouraging. These are stressful times, and we can all use some encouraging words. So some specifics that you can do to build that communication plan and connect with your students and their caregivers is to begin with, as part of that cultivating those relationships, is to create a welcome message. You might consider including something like that slide that Mark mentioned earlier that introduces you to your students and their families. And then from there, consider a weekly email, something short, concise, engaging, with a catchy headline that keeps everyone really in touch with what the assignments are, what the expectations are, or how feedback is provided. Consistency is really key here. So you might want to consider putting it on your calendar for a specific day so that families know that on Monday morning, they should look for an email from you, or Friday afternoon, whatever works for your schedule. And then regular individual meetings. This might be, to get away from the idea of email, it might be something like a Google Hangout or Google Meet or a Zoom meeting, or a phone call that is either just with the students, just with the parents, or maybe a combination of everyone for that check-in. And I would suggest perhaps concentrating on those students who need it the most, who need that extra attention in order for them to be successful in class. And as Mark had mentioned earlier, with that encouragement and staying connected, we all are much more likely to do something for someone who understands and appreciates what we're doing and keeps us informed and engaged. And we all want to be engaged with our learning. We want to understand why is it we're doing what we're doing. And so here we're going to go back to Mark, and we're going to deeper dive into engaging our students.
Thank you, Susan. Engaging our students is something we all want to do. The question is, how do we do it in an online environment? We think about what we've done in our classroom to engage our students, and then we think, how do we actually get that to go online? So think about it for a moment. What did you do in your classroom to engage your students? What did you do to engage them in the learning process? And think about the creative ways that we might be able to change that engagement now that those walls of the classroom have been removed. So we were confined to a classroom before. Now we're confined to a screen, but everyone has their own unique environment. What might be different now, and what might we be able to use in our engagement process? How can we be creative in that process? That's what I want us to think about here as we go through a few guidelines on engaging our students. So just like a classroom, an online environment needs structure. It needs structure to support the student engagement. We need to have classroom management techniques, things that are going to help us manage the situation, the engaging of our students. So we need to make sure we get input on healthy communication from our students. What does it mean to engage in communication through a video chat, through an online environment, through emails? Do the students know what it means to engage in that communication? Having their input on that is really important to make sure you include them. What does it mean to have clear expectations for participation? Does everyone expect to participate in a Zoom call? Does it have to happen at exactly the same time every day? How do those things work? We also need to think about what it means to have some basic technology etiquette. Many of our students have been exposed to technology their whole lives, but may have never really been taught what it means to have basic etiquette online. So when do we talk and when do we listen? We need to have that conversation when we're in the classroom as well. Do you raise your hand? Do you blurt out? Are you able to write things down and put them in a box? We have all these different techniques of ways to engage our students in the classroom. We need to make sure we go through those explicitly with our students online as well. When can they talk? When can they listen? When should they mute their audio? When is it okay for them to mute their video? There are all these questions that we didn't think about until we were forced online. And I think if we take the time to go through these things explicitly with our students, we will have a much greater success. The next thing is to give them some responsibility in classroom structures. Allow them to share things that they're proud of. In addition to helping them be proud of things, it also leads to their ownership over the learning. And that's one of the next things that we want to make sure we try and foster and engage in our students, is to create this collaborative ownership over the learning process. It's no longer just about what the teacher says and needs to happen. How do we get them to take ownership over their learning? Maybe allow them to have personalized goals, allow them to set their own goals, allow them to set some goals that may have been outside of the boundaries of before that are neat and exciting and engaging for them. This helps to create a student-centered standard that they can understand, and for the whole class. We also want to get input from the students on what and how they want to demonstrate their knowledge. This provides that ownership. If they can tell you how they want to demonstrate their knowledge, they're going to be much more involved in that process and have much more buy-in when it comes to actually sharing that knowledge or the skills that they've been learning. Another great piece to make this a collaborative process is to engage the parents. What do the parents want their kids to be learning? How do we involve them in the conversation? That may play more at the younger level than it does at the older level, but still, I think it's an important conversation to bring the parents into as well. The next piece on this is really to think outside the classroom. What does it mean to consider now that we no longer have those boundaries of the walls of our classroom for learning? Many of these students can get outside. Many of these students have access to things that they did not have access to in the classroom. Now, be aware that many students also are not proud of their home environments and may not want to share too much. So finding ways of being compassionate and understanding that not every student is going to want to share everything about their personal home life, yet giving them the opportunity to share things that are safe. So think about what it means to have an experience outside of those classroom walls. Is going to help engage our students. The next section we have is on feedback. Feedback is one of those challenging things that we all want to provide more of and never have enough time for. That said, we can give you a few ideas about how to think about feedback online, and then we'll give you some ways of managing that feedback as well. So the first question is, why are we providing feedback? Is it formative, which is just for their learning, so student growth can be open for them to see and hear, and anyone can really see about their learning? So is it really for their own personal growth? Or is it summative, where we're assessing their learning to pass on at that one point in time? Um, I would suggest that most of our assessments and most of our feedback should be formative. If the information they're getting from our feedback does not help them grow, it's not as effective. Summative feedback is really meant for reporting out to other folks and giving us that kind of checkpoint in time. Really, how do we focus more on that formative growth assessment and those feedbacks? So if we're giving a lot of formative feedback, we're also probably providing a lot of assignments. We need to make sure that we set the expectations for those assignments appropriately. Many assignments are required. Some may not be required. They may simply be for student enrichment and supporting students who need more practice. That is absolutely okay to have optional assignments as we're looking at them. The question comes down to when an assignment is required, are we going to provide feedback? And if we are going to provide that feedback, how are we clear on how that feedback is going to come? What expectations are there going to be for that final product? And how are they going to get feedback if they are going to get feedback on that assignment? We'll give a few techniques on how to provide feedback in the next slide. The last thing here is who should be providing the feedback. And this is crucial for teachers. We always want to give feedback to every student if we have time, which we never have enough time. There's just not going to be that option for us in these situations. So how do we make sure students get the feedback they need or they can use if we can't give them all the feedback they need? So who can provide that? We could provide it themselves. If we give them the appropriate structures like rubrics, they can look at the rubric and do some self-critique and self-evaluation. We can have peers. A peer evaluation is a great way to give feedback. I know when I was in high school, one of the best classes I had peer feedback happening almost every week. And that gave me feedback that I couldn't get from the teacher because the teacher didn't have time. A parent, is there a situation where a parent can give students feedback on these things? A parent is going to be much more interested in their students' outcome than they are in other people's outcomes, right? Many parents want to be very involved in their students' education. So that's an opportunity. And then there is the teacher. So those 4 different areas: self-feedback, peer feedback, possibility of parent feedback, and then the teacher feedback are all areas that you can use now in this feedback realm. So here are some tips for managing the volume of feedback that we get as an online instructor. One of the key things to do is to set aside a regular time to provide feedback online. This routine helps when the structure of the classroom happens to be missing. Focus on the students with the greatest need. These students need detailed feedback for their support. We need to provide resources for self and peer assessment. We have built a culture of personal ownership over this class, and if we've built that culture of personal ownership correctly, providing rubrics, sentence starters like "I like because it blank" or "I'm confused about" will help the students understand what they need to be providing in terms of that peer feedback. And last, and definitely not least, timeliness. Prompt feedback is more important than quality feedback. The more time passes between when a student finishes an assignment and when the student is given their feedback, the less relevant that feedback becomes.
As we come to a close, let's take a look at some application and takeaways for today's session. I invite you to consider what can you do in each of the areas that we've presented to you today to extend your best teaching practices into an online environment. So in considering what you're taking away from this session, I encourage you to pause the presentation and reflect on what you've learned today and take a look at the action plan that we've provided to you to see if you've really actually written anything down, or if you may want to go back and rewind and revisit one of these sections. Here's an opportunity for you to put into practice your thoughts and ideas and capture those ideas that you can implement right away. Because we all know that when we make a commitment to an application, that we're much more likely to have that new learning. And thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it for one more time back to Mark Neiman for our closing.
Thank you, Susan. We just want to let you know we really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video on best practices in online teaching. With so many resources for teachers out there in these challenging times, we hope this has been helpful. As we're working to provide our community with resources and support in this new educational environment, we would really appreciate you taking a moment to fill out a quick survey to inform our continuous improvement process. Thank you again, and please feel free to contact us at any time if you have any questions.